Okay, I think we will make a start now. So for everybody who's just joined, a very warm welcome to this Centre for Global Higher Education webinar this afternoon. My name is Rachel Brooks. I'm based at the University of Oxford and I'll be chairing the session today. Just to note that this session is being recorded and the recording will go up on the CG website afterwards. So if you prefer to keep your camera off throughout, that's fine. And I would ask everybody to switch their mics off, although it looks like that's happened automatically, unless you're asking a question, in which case you can unmute. So the purpose of today's webinar is really to launch a new ESRC-funded project on students and politics, which has very recently started on the 1st of May, and it's going to run for the next 3.5 years. And I'll be working on this along with my colleagues Rille Raaper from Durham University and Tom Fryer from the University of Manchester. As it started so recently, we obviously haven't yet started any of the empirical work. So we're really grateful for this launch today. We have 4 great speakers who've agreed to join us and to tell us about their work, which is in a related area. And indeed, many of them, their work has inspired us when we were putting the bid together. We're really grateful that they've been able to join us today, and they're also members of our advisory board. So the format of today's session is that we've got 4 speakers. Each of them will speak for 15 minutes, and then there'll be just a short period, 5 minutes of questions for them before we move on to the next person. Then we're going to briefly introduce our research project before opening the floor up for general discussion and further Q&A. Please do put any questions that you've got for the speakers in the chat as we go along, and then if we've got more questions than we have time for, I'll choose individuals to pose their questions to the speakers. Okay, just going to introduce our 4 speakers now to tell you a little bit more about them, and I'll introduce them in the order that they're going to speak. So Rob is going first. Rob Ford is Professor of Political Science at the University of Manchester, and he works broadly in the areas of public opinion, electoral choice and party politics. His first book, which was co-authored with Matthew Goodwin, was called Revolt on the Right, and this examined the rise of the UK Independence Party, and it was also named Political Book of the Year in 2015. He's also edited 2 volumes of short essays for a general audience looking at voter behaviour and public opinion, Sex Lies and the Ballot Box, and More Sex Lies and the Ballot Box. Great titles. And Rob comments regularly on elections, public opinion and politics for various media outlets. So thank you very much, Rob. Second is going to be Ralph. Ralph Scott is a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow in Politics at the University of Bristol, where he's studying the effects of education on political attitudes and behaviour. Ralph's previously held positions at Cardiff University and on the British election study at the University of Manchester, where he also received his PhD. And Ralph's research has been published in the journals Political Studies, Research and Politics, Parliamentary Affairs and Electoral Studies. We'll then move on to a talk by Gritt. Gritt Nielsen is Associate Professor at the Danish School of Education in Aarhus University in Denmark, and she's used anthropology and ethnography to write about student activism and academic freedom in the contemporary university. Her monograph Figuration Work, Student Participation, Democracy and University Reform in a Global Knowledge Economy, which was published in 2015, explored the role that students play in shaping their universities. And last but not least, we have a talk by Jan McArthur. Is Head of Department and Professor in Higher Education and Social Justice at Lancaster University. And her research interests span 2 themes, education and social justice, and the nature of higher education. And she's interested in interrelationships between education, society, and between theory and practice. And she's explored different interpretations of critical pedagogy, and particularly the ways in which conceptualizations of knowledge impact upon social justice. And her latest book, Assessment for Social Justice, explores the potential to further social justice within and through higher education assessment. So as you can probably see from those biographies, our 4 speakers come at the topic of students and politics from slightly different perspectives. So we hope that it will be a really fascinating afternoon. So thank you again, speakers. And if I could hand over now to Rob, who's going to kick us off, and his talk is called Degrees of Separation, the Rise of Education as a Political Divide. So when you're ready, Rob, if you'd like to share your screen.
Sure. Right. If I can figure out where we need to be. Right. Can everyone see that okay? I'm assuming silence means consent because I can no longer see you.
We can see the slides, but we can see all your coming up slides as well. It's if you just you're able to put it into
is that slide. That was in slideshow mode. I don't know why it was doing that. Is it better if I do it like that?
That looks exactly the same to me, but it's not the end of the world, so don't worry.
Okay. Try that. Is that better? Is that still the same?
That's somebody's put thumbs up, but to me it looks exactly the same.
Okay, well, I might just plow on.
Yeah, you plow on. I think that's really the best thing to do. Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, my sort of angle on students and education divides is a kind of political sociology angle. So a few years ago, I wrote with Maria Sobolewska a book called Brexit Land, which examined the emergence of some new dividing lines in British politics since the EU referendum in particular, and education is a big part of that story. I also did a long review article for the annual review of political science on emerging cleavages and divisions across developed democracies, and education is a big one. So this is very much a sort of big picture story about education divides in British politics, not just students, but basically everyone who went to university versus in theory, kind of everyone who didn't, but in particular those who leave education at the earliest opportunity. So the reason for focusing on those two groups is because since around 2016, it's been very clear that a quite large divide in political behaviour has opened up between university graduates and school leavers, which is a term I'm going to use as shorthand for people who left school at 16 or earlier, because obviously older voters, they often left earlier than that, with GCSE qualifications or less. Now, before 2016, there wasn't, for example, any notable difference in how these two groups behaved in terms of conservative voting. In all of the data since then, this only runs up to 2022, but it's evident in data further on as well. School leavers were much more likely to vote for the Conservatives than university graduates, whereas for the Labour Party, and for the Liberal Democrats, it was precisely the reverse. So graduates were more prone to vote Labour, school leavers became steadily less prone to vote Labour. And Brexit itself was and is one big driver of this education divide. In terms of demographic predictors of behaviour in the 2016 EU referendum, education is one of the strongest predictors available. University graduates were very strongly remain, about 2/3, 70% remain. School leavers very strongly leave, 2/3 to 70% leave. So there's a big divide there, which then has a kind of legacy in terms also of how voters think about themselves in partisan and tribal terms. So school leavers will often tend to identify as Brexiteers, as leavers, and so on. University graduates will very often spontaneously express an attachment to the Remain side. But it also runs deeper than that, because what the Brexit campaign and referendum was picking up was not just views about the European Union and Britain's role in it. It was picking up a bunch of other very important stuff, which is getting mobilized into politics in this kind of educational cleavage. We just had an election a few days ago in Poland, and you saw very similar kinds of factors playing out in that as well, with a kind of socially liberal, more internationalist, more pro-migration candidate, and a very socially conservative, very nationalistic, very Eurosceptic candidate. So there's a kind of cluster or galaxy of beliefs and values that are closely attached to education level, and which have become increasingly closely attached to political behaviour. These are just a few examples. This is identifying as strongly British or English versus identifying as European. We see the same thing with social class identity. Graduates are much more likely to self-identify as middle class. School leavers more likely to self-identify as working class, and we see it on social values. School leavers tend very consistently to be.
Sorry to interrupt you, but your slides aren't moving on. Were they meant to be moving on at this point?
They were, yes. We're having a bit of trouble. This is why I always prefer Zoom, I'm afraid, Rachel. Everything always breaks with Zoom.
Sorry.
Can you see the slide now that I'm on?
Yeah, that's on slide 7. Yeah, thank you.
Have you missed all the previous ones then?
Yes.
Okay. Well, here, just for a quick recap, is Conservative support amongst graduates and school leavers. Here's Labour support amongst graduates and school leavers. As you can see, a divide opening up. Here is EU referendum support. This is support amongst school leavers, much higher than support amongst graduates. Here are views about national identity. School leavers much more prone to have British identity. Here's class identity. Graduates more middle class, school leavers more working class. And here's social values to get us back up to speed. So school leavers more likely to support the death penalty, more likely to support censorship, more likely to support stiffer sentences for lawbreakers, and graduates more likely to hold socially liberal views on those and other kinds of issues. We also see education divides emerging in people's political priorities. To pick two examples, school leavers are consistently more likely to say that immigration is a top political issue for them, whereas university graduates are consistently more likely to say that the environment is a top issue for them. So to sum up, there's a cluster of values and a cluster of issues that show very strong education divides, and those have become mobilized into political behavior, with Brexit accelerating that process. And a further element to this, which we talk a lot about in the book, and which is evident in other countries as well as in Britain, is that the kind of demographic battleground on which this education divide is being fought out is gradually changing because of the process of the expansion of higher education itself. So if we look at the census conducted about 25 years ago now, school leavers outnumbered graduates by a ratio of more than 3 to 1. 65% of the electorate had left school with GCSE qualifications or less. That figure had fallen by nearly 25 percentage points over the following 2 decades to the census of 2021, whereas the proportion of graduates had risen by 14%. So at this point, the two groups are more or less evenly divided. And the reason this is important is because, as Lyndon Johnson said, the first and most important rule of politics is knowing how to count. If we had an electorate like the one in 2001, it would be very difficult for any political party to really be competitive if its support was skewed heavily to graduates. Basically everyone would have to appeal to school leavers in an electorate that is 2/3 school leavers. By the time we get to the 2020s, with an electorate that's becoming more evenly divided on educational terms, that becomes different. And that becomes even more the case when we consider how generationally structured university education is. So graduates already heavily outnumber school leavers amongst voters under the age of 35, and somewhat outnumber school leavers amongst voters under the age of 50. Whereas amongst the oldest cohorts of voters, school leavers are by far the dominant group. And indeed, when you look at the patterns of voting behaviour in the last few elections, alongside education, one thing that constantly emerges is that age is an extremely strong predictor of support. And the differences in people's educational experience are one plausible explanation for that. So now I'm just going to fast forward and talk very briefly, with about 5 minutes or so left, about some of the things that have happened in the last few general elections. So after 2015, so 2015 is the last pre-Brexit election. We then have 2 post-Brexit elections during the Brexit process. And on the Tory Labour side, what happens in short is that Labour advance more in places that have more graduates, and the Conservatives advance more in places that have more school leavers. This graph on the right is essentially the story of the so-called Red Wall. These are the seats where the Conservatives are advancing that have relatively few graduates. This story on the left doesn't become a very important story in this period, but it will become important in coming slides. This shift, with Labour concentrating in graduate-heavy areas and the Conservatives advancing in areas with lots of school leavers, was electorally advantageous for the Conservatives because of the nature of our electoral system, which is first past the post. Graduates tend to cluster together in a relatively small minority of seats. I'm sat in one, some of the other speakers are probably sat in others, places like big cities, like Oxford, like Cambridge, and so on. And Labour actually made a big advance in seats like that during these two elections, but ended up with far fewer seats overall. Why? Because the Conservatives were advancing in seats where there are very few graduates, and there are a lot more of those seats. So this was essentially Labour's electorate becoming less electorally efficient and the Conservatives' electorate becoming more electorally efficient. Now, the people who took over Labour after the 2019 election noticed all of this and were very determined to reverse it. Deborah Mattinson, who was Labour's head of strategy, started talking constantly about hero voters, which was essentially leave voting, older, non-graduate voters. And everything that Labour did during the 2020 to 24 period was designed to try and improve Labour's appeal to those voters, and hence reverse the trend towards doing better with graduates, which wasn't doing Labour any favours in the aggregate. Now, at the same time, the Conservatives were actually paying a price for advancing in seats with lots of school leavers, which is that they were going backwards in the seats with the most graduates. But in many of those seats, they started with a big cushion because these were often sort of home counties, prosperous seats where the Conservatives have been locally dominant for a long time. The Liberal Democrats, though, were steadily advancing in those seats during that 2015 to 2019 period, but nobody particularly noticed it at the time because they didn't win any of them. So the Tory majorities were getting slimmer, but the Tories were continuing to hold the seats. No one was saying, hold the front page, here comes a big Lib Dem landslide in the home counties, until all of a sudden there was a big Lib Dem landslide in the home counties. So if you look at that first graph, you see all of these seats with lots of degree holders and a big Lib Dem advance between 2015 and 2019. And look at this one where I've coloured in who won the seat in 2024. All of those seats at the sort of top right end of the graph, they're mostly Lib Dem won. And this is what accounts in particular for the Lib Dems' best performance in 100 years. The Lib Dems have aligned themselves with university graduates in the south of England and have essentially become a party representing a big chunk of graduate-heavy South England, a sort of regional graduate party. At the same time as all of that was happening, and the Lib Dems were very happy, something was happening for the Conservatives that was very bad for them. They faced a kind of loss at both ends. They were losing the graduates to the Lib Dems, but we also saw a re-emergence of the education divide on the radical right flank with Reform UK, who do a lot better in places with lots of voters who are school leavers, and a lot worse in places with lots of university graduates. And if we plot out who won the seats in 2024 and how the Conservatives did between 2019 and 2024 against shares of graduates, unfortunately, I couldn't get the colours right for this in time. The light blue are Labour, I know that should be red. The sort of teal are the Lib Dems, I know that should be yellow. You can see the Reform victories down here in the seats with the very fewest graduates. But you can also see big Conservative drops in lots of these seats with few graduates, and it's Labour who are winning those seats. So although Labour are not necessarily advancing much themselves, they're able to win because the Conservatives are losing lots and lots of votes to Reform. And then with the Tories tide going out and the Reform vote not coming up enough, Labour come in through the middle. This is first past the post operating again. As I mentioned, we also see on the other side of the education divide that the Lib Dems make lots of gains in the areas with the most graduates, the fewest voters with no qualifications. On the other hand, if we try and look at Labour's performance against education between 2019 and 2024, we see that in a sense, Morgan McSweeney and Deborah Mattinson were successful in exactly what they aimed to do. There's virtually no relationship between Labour performance and either the share of graduates or the share of school leavers in last general election versus 2019. So in a sense, they've started to unwind the relationship that existed before. However, if we look just at the seats where the Conservatives started first and Labour started second, which is the kind of core battleground for Labour, they do worse in the seats with the most school leavers, which is again reform peeling off some of the support that might otherwise have gone from the Conservatives to Labour. So this is another element of the education divide emerging. And of course, what we've seen in polling since then is reform continuing to advance, and that advance continues to be concentrated amongst the school leavers. So if we ran that line now against the polling we have now, I suspect it would be a good deal steeper. So I want to end with just two kind of forward-looking points. The first is the Conservatives kind of won a landslide in 2019 by bridging the education divide. They then collapsed in 2024 because the education divide reopened. And right now, we face the possibility that the education divide could become so deep that it actually kills them off altogether as a party that can win under first past the post. They've already lost their 2019 gains amongst school leavers because Farage has essentially eaten their lunch. There's no reason to think that they're going to be able to unwind that because most of those voters prefer the full-fat Farage option to the semi-skim Tory option. But they've also declined for the best part of a decade in areas that have a lot of graduates. And that decline has now taken them past the tipping point where Ed Davey's Liberal Democrats can also eat their lunch in a different part of the country. And if we look at the local elections that happened last month, there is no evidence of them seeing any kind of reversal of that divide, that decline either. In fact, if anything, it's accelerating. Given that, they may well have gone from being the party of two tribes, Brexiteer school leavers on the one hand and home counties remainers on the other in 2019, to being a party of no tribe and having essentially no geographical or social core, which would leave them, ironically, being displaced in the 2020s in a very similar way to how Lloyd George's Liberals were displaced exactly 100 years ago in the 1920s. That should say extinction in 2029 rather than 2024. Still a question mark on that, of course, long Parliament to go. And then a final point to end on. All of this is still not taking place in a static battlefield. We are still seeing considerable demographic change going on. And if we project forward the changes that we've seen in the last couple of censuses to the end of this decade, then by the time we get an election towards the end of this decade, a majority of the seats that will be up for election will be seats where graduates outnumber school leavers for the first time ever. Whereas a few election cycles ago, the seats with school leavers outnumbering graduates were by far the greater number, hence Morgan McSweeney's focus on electoral efficiency. But the electorally efficient thing to do in future will be very different to the electorally efficient thing to do in the past. So although there's been all this change in terms of the party support, there's also change going on in terms of the composition of the electorate. And I'm sorry that I've run a couple of minutes over. If any of that's interested you, here's a couple of the books that it's based upon, and I'll hand back now and stop sharing my screen.
Great, thank you very much, Rob. That was really fascinating, and your Brexitland book was something that definitely inspired us when we put our bid together for this project. We've got one question in the chat from Suzanne Elliott. Suzanne, do you want to try and unmute yourself and ask your question yourself? I'm not sure if you can. Oh, she can't unmute. Hang on, if you just wait with me a second, I'll see if I can do that for her. We've got quite a few people here, so it'll just take me a while to go through her, get her name. Right, Suzanne, you should be able to.
Hi, Rob.
Hi.
Right.
That was really interesting. Thank you. I was just wondering whether I was trying to catch up with you. There's lots of stats to get my head around, but did you have a sense that there are more school leavers voting in 2024 than in previous post-Brexit years, like they're a group of people who might have previously been described as disenfranchised and disillusioned with the political process. I'm wondering whether they've regained their faith and are voting more frequently.
No, quite the opposite. In fact, I think the turnout in 2024 was down quite substantially on 2019. It was the second lowest turnout we've seen in a universal franchise election, only just ahead of the low point in 2001. And that decline does seem to have been larger amongst school leavers, particularly larger amongst younger school leavers. I mean, there's all sorts of incidentally nuance to this. I've been painting with a very, very sort of broad brush here, but one example is that younger school leavers are also a lot more socially conservative than younger graduates. But we don't see that as much politically, because whereas both older and younger, whereas both older graduates and older school leavers vote at high levels, older people in general vote very high levels, younger school leavers in Britain tend not to vote at all. So the kind of young voters going over to the radical right thing that's been a big thing in Europe, where turnout levels in general are higher, much more muted in Britain, but not necessarily because the potential for it doesn't exist, but simply because right now those voters don't really vote at all. You get like 30% turnout rates in that group. And yeah, 2024 was not an encouraging election in that regard. In fact, the only encouraging elections in the past 15 years in that regard have been 2016 with the EU referendum, and to some extent also 2017 for somewhat complicated and slightly different reasons to the EU referendum. But yeah, the 2024 election was not an encouraging election if you're interested in political engagement, I'm afraid.
Okay. I'm just trying to work out whether to take hope from your from your slides or not. I'll keep working on it.
Not entirely, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Suzanne. Are there any other questions for Rob? Well, there's time to come back at the end if one occurs to you. But if I could ask you one, Rob. So, I mean, you talked about kind of, Labour's changing views of graduates. What's your assessment, I suppose, of what their perception is right at the moment in relation to the graduate vote? Because there's lots of speculation about, what the changes for higher education are going to be. Do you have any insight into, any views about wanting to sort of retain graduate votes and so have graduate-friendly policies?
I think at the moment that there's quite a lot of internal division in Labour about this. So I think the people around Starmer, who obviously just engineered a landslide election a year ago, and so feel that they know what they're talking about, tend still to be of the view that older school leavers are the electorally pivotal group, given the geography of the country, and are therefore now becoming very anxious about reform. On the other hand, the electoral landscape is never static, and what we have been seeing in the polling since the election is that Labour is losing a lot more support on its kind of graduate socially progressive flank than it is on the reform flank. And if you see kind of really tangible trouble for graduates and graduate interests, like, for example, higher education institutions getting into trouble, then I think that would even accelerate that process. And there are already quite a number of people in Labour expressing concern about that and saying we can't afford to lose on that flank either. So at present, it's not clear how that's going to go. That particular argument is going to work out, but it's certainly an issue that is a live debate within Labour at the moment.
Great, thank you very much. As I was saying, if you have got other questions for Rob that occur to you during the afternoon, please do put them in the chat and we can come back to them afterwards. But maybe we'll move on to our second presentation now. Thank you very much, Rob, for that. And Ralph is going to go next. Ralph, do you mind sharing your slides? And Ralph's talk is called, or you can see it there, it's called, Is Higher Education a New Political Cleavage in Great Britain? So over to you, Ralph, when you're ready.
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, and as you can see, this is work that I'm carrying out with Rob, as well as Hannah Bunting and Maria Sobolewska, and it's kind of building on, I guess Rob provided the kind of big picture and the kind of recent history of the relationship between education and voting in Britain, and I guess this is kind of looking more at the mechanisms or the way in which education might be influencing people's political preferences. And this is work that's been supported by the ESRC through a UK and a Changing Europe fellowship that Rob held, and that funded the data collection, and then also the Leverhulme Trust funded my work on it through the fellowship that I'm currently working So yes, there we go. So to start with kind of the overview of why we think this is an important question. As Rob has kind of set out, and not just in the British context, this is true across various countries, the role that education plays in shaping an individual's political attitudes and behaviour is increasingly well observed. It's kind of there in lots of comparative studies, as well as kind of single country studies. And in Britain, in particular, it separates voters on this kind of graduate divide, separates voters on issues, and has led to the emergence of new parties as well as the transformation of existing ones. And Rob kind of explained that really well in the last presentation. And some have made the argument that it represents a new cleavage across Western Europe. So what we do in this paper is we extrapolate from the Danish case, where Stu Barger looked at this in quite a lot of detail across a series of papers, to kind of build on that and look at a similar question in the British context. So I've thrown out quite a few concepts, and just to kind of define those concepts with reference to the theory, and then kind of establish what we're testing in this paper. When we talk about kind of political cleavages, this is a concept that was first conceptualized in a book by Lipset and Rakan in 1967, which is very influential. And the kind of core idea, if we kind of boil it down, simplify it very much, is this idea that social divisions, so kind of divides in society, find their expression through political party systems, which are then frozen and kind of persist once the strength of the original divide has subsided. And this, as a kind of very influential idea within the study of politics, this has been built on in various ways and developed further. And it was kind of made a bit more, like formalized a bit more by Bartolini and Mayer, who suggested that there had to be three elements for something to represent a political cleavage, a kind of full political cleavage. So the first of these is that it relates to social structure, so that there's a difference based on descriptive characteristics that you can observe. The second is a normative divide, so this is a divide in values and beliefs between like across that kind of divide, and then also social identity and group consciousness. And it's social identity and group consciousness that we're really focusing on in this paper. And then thirdly, there's also a role of institutions. So you have these kind of existing divides in the population, but they have to be kind of capitalized upon and politicized by political parties and politicians. And in terms of what this actually looks like in the British context, and in fact, you know, across the world, in the post-war period, social class was really the dominant political cleavage. Definitely in Britain, in the early kind of quantitative studies of British political behaviour, it's all about social class. Basically, that's kind of what motivates support for the Conservatives or the Labour Party, who are the dominant parties at the time. But there's also copious evidence of a long process of class de-alignment, so people no longer supporting the party that you would predict based on their kind of occupational class over the course of the 20th century. And people who've looked at this in depth attribute this to deindustrialization and the rise of the knowledge economy, and also to kind of the process of globalization and all of the social structural change that led to, including you know, more and more people gaining degrees and kind of progressing further in their education. And this led to where there's previously kind of one main dimension in political competition, it led to the emergence of a new cultural dimension where parties would compete to attract support. And that's kind of what we've seen, particularly in Britain, with in the kind of post-Brexit period. It was building up to that point, but Brexit was kind of like something that really intensified that process. So research that looked into this this kind of new cultural cleavage and the role of education in it has focused a lot on the importance of social identity. There's been some really interesting studies, kind of comparative European studies, looking at this over the last year. So it's important to kind of understand what we mean by social identity, and this is a concept that's taken from social psychology, which whereby it basically social identity consists of having an awareness of your awareness of your membership of a particular social group, and then also kind of having a judgment of that. So, you know, I'm a member of the working class and I'm proud of it, or I'm a graduate and that's a positive thing. And group identity is often measured, this kind of social identity is often measured in the context of political science through feelings of closeness to given groups or positive sentiment or preference towards in-group members. So moving on to kind of, I guess, account for how much of that Bartolini-O'Meara definition we already meet in Britain. I think it's fair to say that there is this observable empirical divide. So there has been a growing proportion of people holding degrees. It's not quite 50-50, but it's getting closer. And as Rob said, the age structure of it means it will continue to kind of get closer to that kind of distribution. There are also substantial educational divides in values and beliefs. So graduates tend to be more socially liberal across a range of things and less ethnocentric, less likely to be prejudiced, the more supportive of immigration in general. And there's also, and this is more kind of anecdotal, I'm keen also to study this a bit more systematically. But there is evidence that it's been mobilized by political actors. So you see it in terms of voting patterns, but also in terms of political rhetoric, whereby parties on the kind of conservative right of British politics are occasionally mentioning the role of universities in kind of, I guess, indoctrinating, or as Badenoch described higher education as poisoning the minds of young people in Britain, I think. So there is this kind of politicization of higher education and kind of placing themselves on one side of this cultural divide. But there is limited evidence on the extent to which the education divide represents a social identity divide. So that's what we look at here. So to talk about the method, as I've said, there's good evidence that graduate status structures these kind of other aspects. But for it to represent a political cleavage, we'd need to see that graduates and non-graduates identify with their educational in-group, the educational social identity. So this concept of educational social identity that we're testing here, that we also see that translates into support for political parties that we'd expect to see, and then also support for appropriate political candidates. So to test this, we commissioned YouGov to survey just over 3,000 British voting age adults. We sampled from the British Election Study Internet panel so that we could gain some extra variables, because we could link it to Wave 25 data. And we carried out the fieldwork towards the end of 2023. And we've weighted it by YouGov's standard weights that include gender, age, education, social grade, political attention, and past vote in the Brexit referendum and the last general election when this work was done. And we developed 3 new measures, drawing on the kind of work of Stu Barger and other work in this area of social identity. So the first of these is about educational closeness, which I think is the kind of simplest of these, the most straightforward, where we set out to people, we kind of propose to people that there are these 2 distinct groups between graduates and non-graduates, and we ask people whether they feel closer to one of those 2 groups or they feel kind of in the middle on a 5-point Likert scale. And that's adapted from a measure from that Stu Barger used in the I think it was in the Danish context here. The second of these is a bit more explicit, I guess a bit more politicized, where we ask people to what extent they think graduates are leading society in the right direction, or understanding how society works, or there are some reverse coded items as well. So graduates are out of touch, or they're trying to impose their values on others. And each of these is on a 5-point agree, disagree scale. And then we kind of just summarize this, a mean on the scale once everything's been coded in the same direction. And then the final is I think the subtlest, and this is our measure of in-group preference, where people were basically asked about these 9 jobs on the right-hand side of this slide. Whether they think these jobs should require someone to have a degree in order to do those jobs. And some of them are jobs which do require a degree, and some don't, and some didn't used to require a degree and now do. We essentially just take a kind of average of their degree preference across all of these jobs. The results don't change actually there's different ways of constructing the scale, and the results don't change a lot if you construct it differently. But what I'll be presenting is just an average across these, and we're taking that as a kind of latent graduate preference, as in if on average you think more of these jobs should require you to have a degree, that's a kind of overall preference towards degrees, and the same in the opposite direction. And then in terms of the other variables, we look at, in terms of outcomes, we look at vote intention as reported at the time, but we also look at party like scores, because yeah, with a first past the post system, at least at the time, people got squashed quite a lot into the two main parties, and we also want to look at how people feel about the other parties, such as the Greens and Reform. And then in terms of candidate preference, we carry out a survey experiment, which I'll talk about in a little bit more depth when I get to that towards the end of the presentation. And then in all of the analysis, I'm going to show we control for age, gender, social grade, and importantly, graduate status. So everything you see is adjusting for the effects of graduate status. This is kind of over and above that educational status. So on to the results. The first is this validation hypothesis that I set out. Basically, do graduates and non-graduates identify with their respective educational in-groups? And what we see here is, yes, they do, fairly strongly, particularly on the group closeness and the group consciousness measures. There are big differences in the means on each of these scales. So I should say each of the panels in this figure represent each of the scales. So there's group closeness, group consciousness, and in-group preference, which is the jobs measure. Yeah. So it's worth bearing in mind the relative strength of these when we come to interpret the subsequent slides. I think it's also possibly interesting that graduates seem to feel it more strongly than non-graduates. They're further away from the mean. So it suggests there's a degree of asymmetry there, which is interesting, I think. Moving on to look at vote intention. And here, each of the lines represents one of the 5 parties that compete across Great Britain. And basically, the more the scales are now on the x-axis. So the more to the right on those scales you are, the more pro-graduate you are. And the y-axis measures the probability of reporting a vote intention for a given party. And essentially, you can see that the more pro-graduate you are, the more pro-Labour you are, more pro the Labour Party you are. The stronger you feel this kind of pro-graduate social identity, and the opposite is the case for parties of the right, particularly for Reform. The relationship's quite strong, and the Conservatives on the in-group preference measure. But I think, as I said before, the nature of the electoral system means it's actually more instructive, I think, to look at something like a party like score, which is measured on a 0 to 10 scale. How much do you like each of these parties? And here, I think there's a few interesting things shown here. The same relationships are evident, as in social identity, educational social identity predicts preferences across these kind of, I guess, what you might consider blocks. So the kind of left liberal block and the right conservative block. But there's quite a strong degree of alignment in terms of liking Labour and the Greens and the Lib Dems as well, which I think possibly helps to. It doesn't go all the way, but there was quite a lot of tactical voting going on at the last general election, which is just after this work was done. So basically those relationships are quite closely aligned, whereas Reform voting is predicted much more by this scale of educational social identity, as in if you dislike graduates, you're much more likely to support Reform than the Conservatives, where those lines are a bit flatter for the Conservatives. So to move on to the candidate experiment, which I'll cover kind of very briefly in the time I've got left. What we do here is we ask people to consider 2 candidates for local councillor, and we randomise 7 characteristics, which are the candidate's education, gender, age, localness, profession, income, and a political issue that they campaign in or they're particularly interested in. The education measure within that has 4 levels. So a school leaver at 16, school leaver at 18, having a degree in chemistry or a PhD in chemistry. And we're particularly interested not in the effective education itself, but how that effective education varies by the respondent's educational and social identity. So if someone who feels more positive about graduates, do they also indicate a graduate preference when it comes to this experiment, this candidate experiment? With an N of with a kind of sample of over 3,000, 4 levels of education, and its expected effect size of 0.05 based on a meta-analysis of similar kind of conjoint studies, we estimate statistical power of 87%, which is above the threshold of 80%. So we're fairly happy with that. So this is the effect of education on saying that you would like to vote for a candidate when it's not interacted with any respondent characteristics. And you can see it's fairly flat. So on average, the average British voter doesn't prefer a school leaver or a graduate candidate. But when you interact it with respondents' education level or graduate status, you see quite a strong interaction whereby graduates prefer graduate candidates, and non-graduates prefer non-graduate candidates on a kind of overall. And then furthermore, when we interact it with educational social identity, you see fairly strong patterns whereby for the two kind of degree, again, yeah, in a very similar way, graduates prefer those who have a strong educational social identity, pro-graduate social identity, prefer graduate candidates, and the opposite's true for non-graduates. It becomes a bit less evident in this final panel, where it's only the extremes of the candidate characteristics, as in having a PhD or having left school at 16. That may be because of kind of a baseline expectation. It's interesting to think about why that might be. But yeah, I mean, overall, you can see that the educational social identity is driving preferences here for candidates. So to kind of summarize, we think we find evidence that higher education is representing an emerging political cleavage in Britain. Alongside all the other evidence on this topic, this is our kind of unique contribution here is this point around social identity. So graduates and non-graduates do identify with their in-group, they feel closer to and more positive about them, and this motivates party and candidate support, even accounting for the effects of education itself. In a choice experiment, we find that those with stronger educational social identity are more likely to support in-group candidates. And we think this suggests that this educational divide will continue to restructure party competition in Britain over the kind of coming years. Thank you. That's everything from me.
Great, thank you so much, Ralph. Another really fascinating presentation. If you've got a question for Ralph, do pop it in the chat. But I'll kick off with one. Apologies if you said this, Ralph. But so in your sample, did you have people who could have a kind of, I suppose, a realistic prospect of going on to become a graduate? So, for example, did you have like 16 to 18-year-olds, so that we can be sure that what we're actually talking about here is actually the experience of higher education? So, but apologies if you already answered that. And the second question would be about thinking about international comparisons, because you said that this was influenced by a Danish study. Did the Danish study find similar things or not?
Yeah, thank you. So on the first point, it's voting. We included those who are sorry. So the age limit was those who are eligible to vote in UK parliamentary elections. So it was people over the age of 18. We have in the British election study, there's a handy variable called the any uni variable, which rather than asking people about qualification, because of how you measure education, there's lots of different ways of measuring it, right? And that variable is useful because it breaks it down by, having never gone to uni, currently at uni, attended uni but didn't graduate, or went to uni and got a degree. And I have done the analysis using that variable as opposed to the qualification variable, defining graduate, I think, as having had any exposure, including having gone to university. Again, like how you categorize current students, you can put them in either category, and it doesn't make a huge amount of difference to the results, partly because the group's fairly small. But yeah. So I mean, there are still people, I guess, who could go on, and who could go on even as adults to go, who aren't graduates, who might go on to kind of do further education and get a degree. But yeah, I guess it's tapping into the point that this study in itself isn't panel analysis. We're not observing this change in social identity over time. It's cross-sectional, but I think it's still kind of indicative of something. And yeah, the Danish study did find, I mean, I think it's one of those things where it'd probably be interesting to try and replicate it either way, but I guess it's more interesting to look at it. It's kind of more, I think it's probably more influential because it found a relationship, that the Stubager work. I think one thing that we're thinking about, because there are a variety of explanations for why education might influence your political attitudes and behavior, and I think in that work, he compared the effects of social identity. So I think it kind of boils down to three main things. One is this kind of social identity component. Another is changes to political values and attitudes, which I guess is related but slightly different. And a third is, changing your political interest, as in you earn more money. And so changing your kind of the material, that there are other changes that education affects in that way. So yeah, thinking about, obviously we are controlling for some of those things in this, but thinking about yeah, whether we do a mediation analysis or something is something I'm thinking about and I've experimented with. But yeah, the Danish study, we can, I guess in that way we kind of echo what their findings are, but in a different context with a different electoral system and various other kind of differences, obviously a different educational system as well.
Great, thank you very much. And we have a comment in the chat from Bernard, but I don't think that's a question. That's just a link. So thank you for that, Bernard. Okay, if there aren't any, not quite sure what that is. Looks like that's a description of a previous webinar or a future one potentially. Okay, so if you've got any questions, it's just a reference. Okay, thank you. If you've got any questions for Ralph, do feel free to put them in the chat as we go through the rest of the afternoon, and we can come back to them at the end. But that last comment is a nice link to our third talk, which focuses on the Danish context. And so welcome Gritt, and Gritt's going to be talking about policing student protests, safety, free speech, and calls for stocking foot activism. So over to you when you're ready, Gritt. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And yeah, it's a nice continuation now. So we'll be moving from like looking at voting patterns and representative democracy and political science to more kind of ethnographic work and focusing on all the political stuff that goes on outside these formal political system and representative governing bodies within universities and so forth. So I'll be looking at, or I thought it would be interesting for this launch seminar to have a bit of a comparative perspective and see what's going on in Denmark in terms of the kinds of activism, the kinds of political engagement that students have been engaging in over the past decade, and the shifts not least, the shifts within university policies and the way that both the state, the ministry, and the universities are attempting to govern students in new ways. So just a little bit of background. So in Denmark, as you maybe know, maybe not, we only have public universities. There's no tuition fees for students. We have a strong tradition for student participation and student involvement. It was introduced after '68. So we have study boards where you have half of the seats are for students, and they have quite a strong voice there if they want to use it. So that's the question, and I'll get back to that later on. But over the past 50 years, since the 70s, where these new reforms were introduced, which democratized the universities, there's been a gradual shift, dismantling university democratic practices and shifting towards kind of more powerful leaderships and a governing system that does not allow for democratic processes to influence the decision-making process in the same way as earlier on. And likewise, there's been a decrease, you could say, since the 70s at least, in student engagement in formal student and university politics. So it's actually quite difficult sometimes to get students to run for offices and to find students who want to join the boards and so forth. Over the past 8-10 years, we've seen a new cycle of student activism. There's been more focus on social justice questions, inclusion, diversity, new forms of engagement among students. And recently, there's also been a shift within the kind of repertoire of action that they are using. And it's interesting to reflect upon what's going on then. I mean, students here currently are politically socialized within a period of growing polarization, as we just heard as well. And it does shift the role and attention to the university in general in a new way. And what kind of role does it have in liberal democracy? So that's pretty much what I'm going to take you through, those shifts. So since 15, 17, 18, we've seen more students getting involved in these questions around social justice, but they have been doing it in very non-public kind of activist ways. So it's not about protesting and occupying buildings in that period, at least. There's been a few incidences, but primarily it's been what I would call everyday activism or contact activism, complaint activism. So it's a question of getting in contact with authorities, pushing for changes, pointing towards critical issues within the curriculum or social activities where there's been debates around traditions for dressing up and whether or not you could do that or whether that was kind of appropriate in cultures and those questions. And we've seen many kind of small student collectives within disciplinary or subject kind of departments popping up, creating safe spaces to discuss their own programs and discuss literature and so forth. And those initiatives have generated like extreme public attention and public debate. I mean, you could argue that these are small kind of incidences that takes place within the university, and why are they so interesting? Well, there's been a huge debate, and it's mainly been driven by like right-wing politicians, like this man up in the corner, dressing up as a Mexican to protest some of the decisions made by leaders at the University of Copenhagen to not allow students to dress up at parties and during the induction weeks and so forth. So he literally came to the university to protest that decision, saying it was too woke and identity politically kind of inclined, and it's a threat to free speech. And that's basically what's been going on, those kind of conversations in that period. So the critique was that we are now seeing a new generation of young people who are kind of showing a readiness for taking offense. It's a literal kind of translation for a concept in Danish, krænkelsesparathed. So they are too easily offended, and we need to do something about it, was the argument. And so what was done in the wake of heavy political pressure, I think, in the public debate, and also a free speech commission, which identified identity political initiatives at the university as a potential threat to free speech. Several universities in Denmark wrote kind of new declarations of free speech and academic freedom. And what's interesting here is that all of them, across all these different declarations, and now I'm going to read, acknowledge the value of inclusion and a respectful civil tone of debate at the university, so that's important. But all of the declarations also emphasize that such values and wishes cannot be used to restrict freedom of speech and academic freedom. So we have free speech and academic freedom, which is over kind of values or ideals about safety, inclusion, civility, care, and so forth. So that was in the early 2020s and 22. Then this happened. Pro-Palestine activism around 24 in the spring and summer 24. We had an encampment at Copenhagen University, students calling for divestment from companies linked to Israel, investment transparency within the university, set up this encampment, and they had a long dialogue actually with the rector and the leaders at the university. But at the end, only the first aspect, like in terms of divestment, was partly complied with by the university. The rest, including ending institutional cooperation with Israeli academic institutions and acknowledging and condemning the situation in Gaza as genocide and several other questions, the university did not comply with. So that led to a second kind of period of student activism where they made use of different kinds of more perhaps confrontational strategies like occupation and no platforming tactics. And here you can see how Greta Thunberg actually joined the demonstration and occupied a part of the administration building, arguing that now they had been going with a campaign and trying to enter into a dialogue with the university for a longer period than also just the encampments. Actually, they had been going on for 3 years trying to put pressure on the university with no results. So now they had to do something else. And there was a critique that this was so not Danish. So it was not the typical way of acting at Danish universities to call the police. Even if students occupy a building, they're usually allowed to stay there and you enter into a dialogue. The dean, the rector, and others kind of enter into a dialogue with the students for how it could be several weeks. But this time they called the police. And perhaps also because a person like Greta Thunberg was there. She's Swedish, she's not Danish. So she's not a student at this university. So that kind of discussion about who is a student, when do you belong, when is it outsiders actually influencing what seems to be student politics, but is actually someone else coming from the outside, identifying not explicitly, but being viewed as students or not. Those kind of discussions emerged. So this kind of, I've called it now intersectional do-it-ourselves activism. This expression, do-it-ourselves politics, is from Sarah Picard. And there is a sense among many of these young activists that, you know, they need to react. Somehow they find the ordinary system inefficient, the institutional system of governance, and also the party political systems at parliament and the way that politics is conducted in general. It's inefficient, they are passive, they're not changing the world in the right way. So they need to take action themselves. But it's not just for themselves. So they are fighting a fight which is related to themselves, but it's also for wider, you know, a global citizenry to some extent at least. And it's a disruptive politics aiming at shifting status quo. Now, some argue that this is a generational movement. It's providing belonging and hope to young people who are now being politically socialized in this particular period of polarized conversation and conflict and wars and so forth. But in Denmark, we also see, I have a colleague who's been doing work on youth and kind of political awareness and political conduct among primary and secondary students. And he is showing that there's a tendency among those young pupils to actually withdraw. So they are very kind of politically aware, but they would rather talk about politics privately with their family and friends and so forth. So it's a minor group perhaps that are active in the public debate, but many others withdraw from that. And this is where this comes in. In the wake of these pro-Palestine protests, we have the rector here in the old ceremonial hall at the University of Copenhagen, talking about how it's important that students, when they want to influence and change the world, they do it in a proper way. They need to be caring and to show care, tolerance, and not be destructive. And he called for what he then termed stocking foot activism, referring to Savio, the political student leader at Berkeley, who was standing on the top of the roof of a car, the roof there, not with shoes on. And he kind of interpreted that as, so that's the way you are not destroying anything, you are taking care of the community and the material around you. But there are several notions of care here. So in his view, care is about respect, civil conduct within the university community and beyond. But care can also mean to take responsibility. Many of the student activists that I've talked to talk about care and being, to show care for themselves, each other's, for the world, in a relational way. And it's about taking responsibility and creating change. So it's a form of activist acts of care, you could call it, that aim to subvert dominant norms, produce new forms of interconnectivity, and question dominant ways of being responsible as an individual and a university community. And that's why they put pressure on university leaders to change the way that the university invest and their money and relate to international politics, foreign politics, and so forth. All of this has also led to a new way of the ministry of kind of engaging with these issues and engaging with activists. So in the wake of these pro-Palestine protests, the Minister of Science, and she is pictured here, actually took the initiative to introduce what she called an anti-harassment policy. So it's a national policy that was developed with all the rectors, all the vice chancellors of the Danish universities. And now there's a shift in the way that safety and free speech is kind of balanced or conceptualized. So what she says is that everyone must be able to feel safe at the university and participate in teaching regardless of their background or political beliefs. And at universities, critical speech must be presented in a factual or reasoned, in Danish it's called saglig, it's like, anyway, and respectful and proper manner, and never at the expense of safety of others. So they've kind of, compared to the freedom of free speech policies, where safety was kind of below, or freedom of speech was the most important thing. Now safety and a notion of proper and good and respectful conduct is more important. So that raises questions about both the power balances between the state and the ministry, the university leadership and the students, and how they are able to engage in political conversation, and what kinds of conduct students are allowed to engage with, what is deemed political, what is deemed democratic and non-democratic. And overall, it also raises the issue of to what extent the role and aim of the university is now gradually shifting a bit. It's nowhere stated in the Danish university law that the university has an obligation to educate students for democratic citizenship. It's not a part of the purpose. It's about critical thinking, internationally recognized knowledge, and all of that. But if you go to the primary, secondary schools, the high schools, and so forth, kind of educating for democratic participation and engagement is part of their purpose. And it seems like now the government and the ministry is like opening up for conversations around, okay, what should the university do here? So it's about civic virtues, civil conduct. Do they have to engage in character building in some way now, in a different way? And there's a huge debate right now about what we call sindelagskontrol, sindelag meaning mindset. How do the state engage in controlling and governing people's mindset? So pushing towards proper ways, or one proper way of being political. That's kind of the tendencies right now, and it's an open question what's going to happen. And I think the leaders or the rectors are having a very difficult time navigating in this space because there's huge political pressure from the outside, but there's also kind of internal debates, of course, and critique around the role of the university as a political institution or not. Yeah, I think, was that my time, Rachel?
Yes, I'm afraid we're up now. Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'll just end it here then.
Thank you very much. Another great presentation. I've actually got quite a few questions in the chat for you, Gritt. I think we'll take the first two now, and then we'll go on to Jan's presentation, and we'll come back to the others afterwards. So, Alison, I think I've unmuted you, so you should be able to ask your question yourself if you'd like to. Alison Shepherd.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. First of all, thank you for that overview of your research. It sounds like there's some very interesting cultural shifts happening. I was just wondering if you'd explored, either explicitly or you'd come across this during the ethnographic research, why students are rejecting formal university processes in favour of more direct activism. I said in my comments, like, I'm sure we can make some assumptions about why, but I was wondering if any of the activists have explicitly explained that choice.
Mm-hmm. I think it's part of a larger development, so it's not just within universities. It's in general that more and more young people, they get involved in other kinds of politics, so they engage in NGO work or grassroots movements and stuff like that. But within university, they find it too bureaucratic, too slow. They think and feel like if they use these kinds of activism, they are doing something right here and right now. So they're acting on it. They don't have that sense or that feeling of actually acting if they go into those kind of long-term discussions and democratic processes. So that's at least one answer. That's what many of the people or students I've talked to, they say. And it's just more interesting. You know, they have a community, they can meet up, it's ad hoc, there's no kind of formal obligation to show up, or you can come and go and get engaged to the extent that you feel like in that particular period of time. And there's a good deal of community building, sense of belonging in it as well, which you do not necessarily find when you engage in student politics in the union, or you can do that, but or on study boards at least and stuff like that. Yeah.
Thanks, Gritt, and thanks, Alison. I just have one question now from Noah Katz. Noah, if you'd like to ask your question, I think I've unmuted you.
Yeah, thank you. That was really interesting and definitely isn't too dissimilar to, I think, what we've seen in the UK. I wrote in the chat, but on the Gaza protests specifically, did you see a similar change in either the pro-Israel or slightly differently, the less binary, maybe pro-peace activism that might have occurred? Mm-hmm. And with that, you mentioned that universities didn't necessarily engage in dialogue with the protesters as they usually might have done. Did you notice, or did you see any similar reticence from the protesters to engage with their institutions in that dialogue?
So first of all, the last part, the university did engage in dialogue with them for a very long time, actually. So this kind of students against the occupation, they called themselves, started like 3 years prior to the encampments. So they had a long campaign where they had been engaging with the university leaders. And during the encampment as well, they had a dialogue and the university decided to comply with some of their demands. But it shifted because they only complied with one. And then there was a lot of pro-Palestine protest in general outside the university. We have not seen a lot of pro-Israel protests. So there's during the encampments, there was like 1 or 2 Israeli kind of, or Jewish students, actually it was, entering into dialogue with them and being interviewed, but there's no kind of wider engagement in that sense. That's come from the the politicians and in the wider community. So in the public debate, that position has been kind of pushed forward. Did you have another question? I'm sorry. Or was that okay?
No, that broadly answered it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Gritt. There are a few other questions, but we can come back to those in the discussion at the end, because I'd like to move on now to Jan. Thank you very much, Jan. Jan's going to be talking about higher education's responsibility to nurture political sensitivities.
Okay, and there we go. Is that okay?
So yeah, that's great. Do start when you're ready, Jan.
Okay, great. Well, thanks very much for the chance to be part of this and see this really important project launched. I'm particularly pleased to be talking because I'm one of the deputy directors of CG, and so it's great to see this sort of discussion happening in the CG space. I think my take on this is probably slightly different, although I think in what Gritt's just said, I was pulling through ideas here. So I'm going to talk on a slightly more philosophical level, a general level, about the purposes of education and higher education in particular, and argue that it has a responsibility to nurture a political sensibility. And I'm making this argument in the context of the many things we hear about politics being bad, about, you know, learning should be neutral, objective, blah, 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 taking all the words diversity out of every university document in the US and so forth. So it's that sort of position that I want to counter. And all of my work is based on a critical theory perspective, particularly first and third generation Frankfurt School. And so the leading ideas here is that to reject the status quo as neutral or inevitable, and this will be a big theme of my talk, these false presumptions of neutrality, to focus on hidden forms of power and injustice that lead to distortions and pathologies that harm people living their lives in a kindly way, and particularly the idea that injustice is hidden in plain sight. And the argument about, you know, the anti-politics argument is for me very much a form of injustice hidden in plain sight. And it's part of this myth that there is a non-political place, that there's somewhere outside and there's somewhere neutral in society. And there's the profound harm of well, that sounds reasonable enough. The problem with a lot of these things are people say, oh, well, it sort of sounds reasonable, doesn't it? To say we shouldn't be, you know, polluting the minds of young people. Of course that does, but that's not necessarily what's actually happening. And here's another example, sounds reasonable, from the 50s, ways to please a lady, give her a toaster. Now that seemed very reasonable at the time, perfectly common sense. The fact that there are underlying all sorts of things about misogyny and disrespect and misrecognition, perhaps more seriously here, it seemed perfectly reasonable enough to the people in this community that jury was all white. It was just the common sense thing. It was just the way things were done. It was the inevitable way of doing things, but it wasn't. And what a political sensibility does is give every person an ability to see through these things and to see the injustice hidden in plain sight. And this has to be one of the functions of the university. And there's actually no practical way of avoiding it. So it's better to be honest that this is part of what we do. And I also want to say that when students come into the university, it's not as if we politicise them or they politicise themselves. This is the world they're living in. I mean, they come in, it's a political world that they're living in. Or on the colloquial things, a law is passed that changes the benefits they can get, changes their living conditions. They are political beings. A law is or a ruling in a court changes what toilet they're allowed to go to. Of course they're politicised. It's not us doing it to them. It's just the nature of living in a society. And I thought this was quite funny that this is from a few years ago, but that UK universities educate most of the global leaders. So let's hope that when we're educating them with a political sensibility. But this more recently, this is really worries me. And it's a good example of this sort of deficit thinking. The UK Defence Secretary, first off in this thing, he's used the word student politics as an insult. Now, you know, as a degradation. Now, that's quite revealing of a Labour politician. But the second thing is that the argument he has is that the SNP have a political position, part of their political manifesto, where they don't allow government funding to go to companies that produce arms. Now, that's their political position. Isn't that the point of a political party, to have positions like that, and then hopefully, if they're elected, to run the government according to those positions? The idea that the UK Defence Secretary thinks that this is something that should be considered reckless, silly, trivial, like student politics, is deeply worrying on a number of levels about the prevailing understanding in a lot of Western societies at the moment about what being in politics, interested in politics means. And in terms of higher education, I think a really good demonstration of this is what I call the real world discourse, which has taken hold in HE. And I've written about this in an article about assessment. But the real world discourse particularly is linked to things like employability and so-called authentic assessment. And it positions students like these sort of strange creatures here looking down on a real world that they're not part of, which is deeply ironic. But the problem with it, and particularly I've looked at a lot of research on authentic assessment, is generally by paragraph 3, the real world is completely conflated with the world of work. Now, the world of work is important and it shapes who we are, but it's not the whole world. And if we run higher education as if the world of work is all that there is in the world, we're doing considerable damage. But next, it's made external. So the real world, we're told, is out there for students. We're here with you, students, and we're preparing you for that real world out there. We're suggesting students aren't part of a real world. How disrespectful. This generation of students have been through an awful lot. They live in a real world. Let's not pretend it's external. And worse than that, it's a world they're not meant to be able to change. You're here, you need to get these skills because in a real world out there that you don't currently belong to, this is what they want. And so effectively, this whole discourse of real world becomes one of a compliant workforce. And if we're to address the real problems of our age, it's not going to be solved by a compliant workforce. And then linked to this is this idea that the real world is the world of the status quo. It's out there, it's not to be changed. We're just going round in circles forever. And the issue here is that like capitalism has an extraordinary ability to reinvent itself, that innovation and things that are positioned as being innovative or entrepreneurial often sustain the status quo rather than change it, very much in the way Nancy Fraser makes a distinction between transformative and effective change. And again, it's this presentation of it as neutral and therefore as apolitical. And what that means, if you buy into that discourse, what happens is anyone who's looking for change is positioned as being disruptive and divisive. And this leads to this, again, this discourse that the political is grubby and nasty and divisive. And so we need to reframe the consequences of a political sensibility. And that's an urgent role for higher education. And I go here now to third generation critical theorist Axel Honneth and his sense of how we know something is just. Is that which allows the individual member of our society to realise his or her own life objectives in cooperation with others and with the greatest possible autonomy. And we have there that fabulous critical theory paradox of cooperation and autonomy. But I think here is where I think it's what I'm saying is very much resonating with what Gritt just said in her presentation, this interplay and interrelationship between individual and social well-being. And just to sort of flesh it out a little bit more, in Honneth's theory of recognition, there are 3 different realms. And I think this gives us an understanding of where this nurturing of a political sensibility is important in higher education. The first, perhaps less so, is the most intimate one of love and care, you know, the recognition that you're human, the father loving his son unconditionally. But then there is respect or rights recognition. This is a universal form. So these should be rights that we all have, rather than living in a world of charitable exceptions. And we not only should have rights, we should know what our rights are and get to exercise our rights. This is an important part of recognising ourselves as fully functioning, happy human beings. And then thirdly, there's the idea of esteem or merit recognition. So I have here some women learning chemistry or something. And this is the idea that we all should see in ourselves and have recognised by others that we uniquely are capable of doing certain things that contribute to the well-being of others. And in my work on assessment for social justice, this is very much that students should see in the things they learn to do a sense, a strong, clear, explicit, celebrated sense that what they're doing will help the well-being of others. And so there is a human need for political sensibility that needs to be acknowledged and celebrated and not feared. And a person who doesn't look beyond their own well-being and consider broader social well-being is ironically unable to realise their own well-being in this critical theory sense. And I think that speaks a little bit to, again, what the Chancellor in Copenhagen was saying in the previous talk. So I want to just quickly demonstrate these ideas with, actually, this is from phase 1 of CG nearly 10 years ago, a project led by my colleague Paul Ashwin, where we talked to chemistry and chemical engineering students. We met them in first year, and then about 100 of them we followed for 7 years. We interviewed them every year and did a whole bunch of other stuff. But in one of the early things that we wrote from this project, I wanted to really test out the ideas, the theoretical ideas from my work on assessment for social justice, which is that assessment shapes what students learn. So assessment should be explicitly designed to highlight social justice and to produce graduates with a social justice sensibility, which for me is almost just the same as saying a political sensibility. That's what I mean by that phrase. So what we were interested in to see is when they talked about assessment, did they link it to having any social purpose? And we sort of had an idea what we were going to find, but you have to let the students talk. So we found across the first 3 years of transcripts, we found 427 places where they were talking about assessment. And we then linked them to 3 different orientations. An orientation to self. Assessment helps me to learn. So this isn't a selfish thing. This is just a positive thing. But assessment helps me to learn. 303 instances where that's how they talked about it. An orientation to discipline or profession. Assessment prepares me for working in the profession. Doing this assignment is like being a real chemist. So there were 108. And then finally, an orientation to society. Assessment is preparing me to make the world a better place. 21 out of 427, and these were fleeting or tangential. So it just wasn't there, which, okay, probably not unexpected. But the problem is that these students were doing assessments that we might want to call authentic assessment. So they were doing things about a more environmentally effective way of students going from a nearby town onto the campus. The South African students, this project was done at a time of immense water shortage, and water poverty and water justice is a strong social justice issue in South Africa. So they had an assignment looking at better ways to save water. So they were doing tasks that were incredibly socially relevant, but they didn't make the connections. And they didn't make the connections because they often didn't have the time or space for reflection. Because higher education is all now about a crowded curriculum, an assessment, bang, 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 get through and get it done. That's the most important thing. And unless we build into our curriculum and our assessment structures time for reflection on the purpose and time for students to understand what it means that knowledge is not neutral, and I'm drawing here on the fabulous book, The Social Life of Information by Brown and Duguid, which is one of my favourite books. Unless we have time for that, we're not going to achieve this core purpose of allowing the nurturing of a political sensibility. And I want to finish with 2 quotes from the project. I've always wanted to help people and try and save lives. I know that there is a lot of urban places in South Africa that don't have medical aid. If a lot of professionals and specialists work together, that there will be a solution to some of the problems that the whole world faces. Now, this person's whole transcript was full of comments like that. It was full of, I want to save the world, that's why I'm in higher education. It was a sort of delight to read. And then we have this. I want to be able to walk out as a chemistry student that the companies would like to hire. That's also a very reasonable statement. Of course they want their degree to lead to a job. There's nothing wrong with that. But the statements are very different, aren't they? And the reason that's significant is who's saying them. Because this is a girl called Scarlett, and this is year 1. This is Scarlett in year 3. And when you look at her transcripts, she has been depoliticised by her learning and assessment experiences. Not deliberately, but it was just squeezed out. And if we depoliticise our students by design or neglect, we fail at the most basic obligations we have to both individual well-being and social well-being. Nurturing a political sensibility involves joy and responsibility, and it is natural and human. And that's just my ideas for you to think about.
Thank you so much, Jan. That was great. Okay, so let me just go back to the chat. We've got a question from Carlos. Let me just see if I can unmute you, Carlos. I'm really sorry, Carlos. I can't find you on the chat to on the list of people to unmute you. So is it okay if I ask your question? So Carlos's question is, how can academics encourage students to reflect when academics themselves often don't have the time to reflect within a marketized system?
Well, don't we? I mean, you know, I know what you're saying, and I fully understand that the academic workplace in many places, and I'm head of department, and so I see this all the time, is overworked and under pressure and governed by metrics that are totally irrational but seem to have had a life of their own. But, you know, actually, I'm sort of going to push back on this and say we have to find the time. Otherwise, I think we should just pack up and go home and see if there's someone else who can have a go, who's less tired and worn out by the system. And I know that seems a bit harsh, and I've probably lost a lot of friends, but for me, the minute I stop finding the time to think this sort of way about the values, this becomes a really hard job to do. So actually, I think it's just you lose when you do that. You have to find the bits, however tangential or fleeting, that keep you believing that we're doing something that makes a difference. And part of that is just sharing that with students and saying to them that they, you know, it's okay for them to have these aspirations that are positive. It's not daft or silly. I don't think it takes all that much time. It does take a lot of energy when you're worn down and broken by a system that can be very cruel, and I acknowledge that. But that means those of us who are still standing, which is at least some of us today, there's a few of us in the picture, it's our responsibility, isn't it, to do what we can and to keep this message alive, that we have to keep believing that there is something worthwhile and to fight for it. Otherwise it will go. And sometimes academics can sort of act as if we have no agency. We probably have more than most people in most professions. And I think we should be better at using the agency that we have. And I'm not saying that it's not under threat and it's not diminished and that it's not pretty rotten in a lot of places. But we just have to find that time, Carlos. Just have to.
Thanks, Jan. We'll have one more question before we go to Rille and Tom. Soo-Young Lee, I can see you've got your hand up. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question? I've also now realised that I can switch people's cameras on, so you'll be able to switch your camera on as well if you'd like us to see you. Soo-Young Lee, are you there? Possibly not. Okay. So there's another one in the chat from Evie. Evie, Evie Morris, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, guys. I'm hoping you can hear me.
Yeah, we can.
You
should just switch your camera on as well if you'd like to.
I'm just in my office, so I don't know whether I think it's probably just going to come up black. Hi. I was really interested in the sort of those kind of cross between all of those talks, that how much any of the speakers really thought that maybe those rising graduate rates might be impacting the way that the graduate or degree experience is just kind of conceived of as a job ticket. It's been my personal experience post-graduation that a lot of jobs require you to just have a degree, and then it's almost a joke when you get into the workplace at how little you use any of the skills from those degrees. And I just wondered how that interplay is kind of, you feel like that's playing out, and is this graduate or uni experience just simply a sort of new middle class?
Thanks, Evie.
Right.
Jan, do you want to respond to that? I think it was kind of framed for everybody, but since this is your Q&A, you go ahead.
Yeah, I think this is partly a reflection of higher education has lost its way. I'm thinking here particularly of the work of Paul Ashwin and his manifesto for transforming university education, is that, we've often lost the educational purpose, and it's become about skills and getting a job, and not about engaging with knowledge that you then take out into a workforce. So I think it's partly true in that sense, and that this loss of understanding the centrality of engagement with knowledge is, with universities have really pretty much shot themselves in the foot. I think it's hard to judge where and when you use your degree. And that's what we found in our longitudinal project. I mean, we only followed students for 3 years, but it was very, very hard to judge when they were not using their degree. And the discourse they had was often very strange, that they would talk a lot about generic skills, which is like the last thing as educationalists you really want them to be thinking. They did chemistry engineering just to learn how to do presentation skills. But if we looked more closely at the way they talked, we found that the ways of thinking in the disciplines and the ways of engaging with knowledge were evident sometimes. So we did see positives as well. But I think there's a real issue for universities that they have shied away from being comfortable with the core function of engagement with complex and dynamic knowledge.
Thank you very much, Jan, and thanks, Evie. There are lots of questions and comments in the chat, which we shall come back to shortly, I hope. But we're going to move on to Rille and Tom now, who are going to tell us a little bit about the project that we're launching today, and that's drawing on some of the work that we've heard described from our speakers. So Rille and Tom, over to you.
Perfect.
We could.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's better. Thank you.
Perfect. So thank you very much. First of all, I just wanted to say how enjoyable it was to listen to all of the presentations, and it's been so much food for thought. And I was also thinking that we're certainly in really good scholarly company with launching our project, because obviously we've been reading your work as we were thinking about our own ideas, and it's really great to kind of follow where you are going with some of the projects that are ongoing. But Tom and I have then a little task to introduce the project. So as Rachel said, this is a project that is starting and it will last 3.5 years. So hopefully you'll become our friends and follow us as we go. But as you see, broadly, we are focused on the question, which has been going through this whole symposium, is does higher education politicize today's students? And we're particularly interested in understanding any potential changes, or perhaps there are no changes, in terms of students' political knowledge, views and behaviour during their university studies. So that's the kind of the aspect that we're very much focused on as we go through this. But a little bit about the rationale, that what has been behind, and a lot of that relates to what we have been hearing today. So I suppose the one aspect that we are really interested in is this politicization, in terms of, are there any effects of higher education on students in those terms? And as Ralph, I think, very kind of nicely kind of situated us in also those dominant public discourses that are very much looking into universities often as something that poison the minds of young people, or this general assumption that universities are either radicalizing students, or students are becoming very left-wing, or if they're not engaging with politics, then they're certainly snowflakes. So either way, there is there's some sort of kind of problem seen with the students. So that's one aspect that obviously has been at the back of my mind, or our minds, but also in terms of the empirical studies that we have heard examples from quite a few today, which kind of do loads of interesting things in terms of looking into voting patterns. And we also know that Tom and Ralph both have kind of, and obviously Rob as well, are looking into the ways in which there's education divide in terms of how graduates and non-graduates or school leavers exercise their political views. And I know that Tom, your work was particularly looking into how students are becoming perhaps a little bit more left-leaning. One of the recent interesting papers, so if you haven't had a chance to read it yet, but it's from Elizabeth Simon and colleagues who are looking into particularly how it's the STEM subject graduates who perhaps have shown the biggest change in terms of the political views, but also in terms of how the university as a campus and a place and a space could play a role in that. So that's an interesting aspect. And Jan, you brought us really into really interesting discussions around the actual value context and the ways in which, as perhaps even higher education community, do we even agree the ways in which higher education should shape students' views and behaviours politically. And there's quite a lot of examples, and obviously your work is focused mostly on kind of social justice aspects, but there are other examples in terms of environmentalism, environmental sustainability, also the ways in which University of Manchester very much markets itself around social responsibility. So there are a few examples in ways in which we think about what could be the politicizing effects of higher education on students. So we're interested in these debates, but also really wanting to go back to students and look into what then happens to students while they're studying in the university and interacting in those various spaces and modes. So that brings us to the kind of the second aspect that kind of underpins our rationale, is the question around what are those mechanisms of political socialization. Again, we have some, but perhaps not enough evidence to really know at today. And Jan, you were mentioning Paul's work, which kind of, some of those disciplinary areas. We know that colleagues have also been looking into particularly sociology as a subject, and there is kind of debates around, is it the sociology as a subject that is changing students or graduates' views, or is it actually attracting students who already have certain political views or expectations? So interesting questions around the extent to which academic studies shape, and Tom will tell us a little bit more how we are planning to bring that disciplinary aspect into our study. And then we also are really keen to understand the university spaces, those various aspects, and that kind of relates to your work, Gritt, particularly in terms of kind of the student spaces and societies and so on. What are the I guess the places and spaces that students interact that might have a shape, and I'm sure that we will find quite a lot of interesting dynamics around peer influence, informal socialization. There's also evidence from existing research that looks into university towns as being perhaps more of those kind of where the synergies are, that certain types of institutions themselves that have a kind of higher likelihood for those kinds of key groups and influences to emerge. But also the role of student unions that Rachel and I have obviously kind of looked into previous research, and perhaps things around campus life and networks more broadly. So there's a lot of ways in which we want to kind of start mapping those mechanisms. And as we go, we obviously kind of want to perhaps create a much clearer understanding what might be those different avenues. So there's quite a lot of different things in play when we think about the project, but we also have quite a lot of empirical work to do. So I'll pass it on to Tom to explain a little bit more about what we want to achieve and how. So Tom, I'm happy to move the slide, so you just have to give me a kind of nudge.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you for introducing that rationale, Rille, and thank you to the speakers as well. Just to reiterate, as Rille was talking about, I think it's really useful to be launching this project with some of those views, some of those engagement and expertise that you're all bringing from different perspectives. So in terms of what we're aiming to do within the project, we've got 4 particular objectives. The first one of these is a bit more descriptive. So it's generating some knowledge about the ways in which students' political knowledge, views and behaviours is changing over time, if it is at all. So responding to some of those gaps that Rille was talking about. The second objective is very much focused on those mechanisms. So what is it that is happening in higher education? And what are some of the diversity of what's happening in higher education that might be contributing to either some of that stability that we're seeing or some of those changes as well. So that's a particular focus of our project, looking at those underlying mechanisms for some of that change and stability. The third objective is more related to developing theorizations. So that's theorizations both in terms of the mechanisms that are underlying, but also that more normative role as well. So what is it that higher education should be doing around students' political knowledge, views, behaviours? And then finally, to be influencing debate about politicization of students, again, just referencing back to some of those discussions and criticisms of universities. There's a role to be providing some more evidence within some of those debates. So in my best Chris Whitty, next slide, please. So in terms of the research design, what we are going to be doing is conducting some in-depth research that has 2 broad components to it. So the first component is a mixed method longitudinal study. And we're focusing on undergraduate students. Those are home undergraduate students from 4 different disciplines at 4 English universities. So the disciplines that we're looking at are trying to cover a breadth of disciplinary study in universities. So we're looking at biology, business, sociology, and engineering. And in the same way, the universities that we're looking at, they have been purposely selected to represent some of the diversity within the English HE sector. So in terms of the actual tools that we'll be using, there'll be an online survey of students, and that will be longitudinal, so across 3 years of their undergraduate degree. So we're trying to get them right at the beginning of year 1, and then towards the end of their 2nd year and towards the end of their 3rd year, and that's starting to look at some of the changes and stability in some of their politics. We're complementing that with a series of different interviews with some of the students that complete the survey. And they'll happen in year 2 and year 3, where we're able to go in and explore some of the mechanisms that we might be finding and some of the changes and stability that we might be finding in a bit more detail as well. So then the second component that complements this more longitudinal study is a series of work with staff working in higher education and also policymakers. So we're proposing to be doing interviews with senior university leaders and focus groups with teaching staff to be exploring some of the issues around higher education and student politics. And we'll also be doing interviews with representatives from sector bodies as well. So that's broadly speaking what we're going to be doing across the next 3.5 years. Next slide, please. So this is where I probably have to put on my best kind of YouTuber voice of please like and subscribe. So we do have social media pages that have been set up kindly by Rille. So we're on LinkedIn and there's a link, and similarly on Blue Sky as well. And we even have a nice shiny web page on the Education at Oxford as well. And I believe we're going to be circulating some of these links after the session for those of you that want to follow along with what we're doing within the project. And just a quick shout out as well, we are currently hiring for a postdoc, and the closing date for that is Monday, Monday the 9th of June. So there's a link there to that as well if people are interested. Please do get in touch with us as well if there's anything that you think we should be reading, engaging with. We're very open to ideas. So thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Tom and Rille, and hopefully that's given you a flavour of the project. Okay, so we've got 10 minutes left in the webinar. We're not going to get through every single one of the questions that's in the chat now, but what I'll do, I think, is I'll round up a few questions and then pose them to the panel, if that's okay. So Robin, Sharaga, Zachary Spire, Ahmed Ahad and Sasi Kumar, VK Sasi Kumar. I'll ask you for your questions and then we'll go to the panel. So if you could kind of, ask them to one or more of panel members, that would be great. So Robin, do you want to go first? You should be unmuted. Robin, are you there? No, maybe Robin's not here anymore. Okay, so should we go to Zachary? Zachary, can you unmute?
Hello, from the West Coast. Thank you so much. These were super engaging and super interesting work across your panel. My question for Gritt Nielsen, you raised this tension regarding the expectations of the students that you spoke with and their the movement of the bureaucracy within the institution. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk a bit more about how this shift is or is not maybe related to the move from the university as this sort of place, sort of the monastic nature of, for example, the English university. And now it's soaked in virtual learning environments, the distance education as anyone can pick up anything, anywhere, and associate themselves with these spaces. And whether or not, in the time when we're seeing that happening, it's affecting the tolerance, not only of ourselves, but our students towards how they represent themselves in the university and expect the university to represent them. Thank you.
Thanks, Zachary. And we'll just go to a couple of other questions. And yeah, do feel free to kind of frame them for all panel members. Ahmed, do you want to come in?
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, everyone, for the great presentations. I really enjoyed them all. I have a question for Gritt in terms of the lens of acting with care, which is really interesting. I have two questions. One is about the conceptualization of the term, and I'm wondering whose care are we talking about, who is providing the care and who is receiving that care, and from whose lens are we really enacting that care? Is it from the students themselves or the higher education providers? That's my first question. And the other one is about to what extent do you think students are able to enact that care in authoritarian context, or where institutions are not really careful about the voices and opinions of those students? Thank you.
Actually, Gritt, since they're both for you, do you want to answer those quickly, and then I'll try and find some questions for other speakers too. So if you could be brief, that'd be great. Thank you.
I'll try to be brief. So to the first question, I didn't touch upon the whole, the wider context of social movements and social media in shaping these new tendencies and trends within the student body. But I think that that's really important as well. It's not so much about the virtual learning environment within the university and online learning and stuff like that, but it's about how social media and online engagement is really also shaping and influencing the way that they perceive of their own role and the kind of responsibilities they have for changing the world. I could say much more about that, but I'll move on. So the second question, that's really maybe it didn't come over as clearly as I thought it did, but so the notion of care is exactly contested because it's viewed from different perspectives. So when the chancellor says you need to be caring and loving, that's from the institutional perspective. Don't disrupt things, don't destroy things, right? And they convey a different notion of care, which is much more about taking care of minoritized, marginalized students, fellow students, and groups in wider society. They do not see themselves necessarily as minoritized or marginalized, but they are allies, or they want to do well for fellow human beings, and that it's that kind of care. And then your question about authoritarian states. I don't know. I mean, here you could also argue, would they be able to change the world if they comply with the rector's or the chancellor's notion of care? No, maybe not, because in their view, disruption is part of changing the world, because otherwise they're just maintaining status quo, like Jan said. It's like that kind of logic. Authoritarian states, you need a revolution, perhaps, but I leave it at that. But thank you so much for your questions.
Thank you, Gritt. We'll take 2 more questions, and if you could direct them to kind of all of the panel, that would be great. So maybe John Brennan, and then we'll finish with Amanda Liu, who's a Year 13 student. So it'd be good to have your perspective, Amanda. So John, do you want to go ahead? Or maybe, there's John there. No, okay. Amanda, do you want to go ahead?
I think it's done now.
Sorry?
Can you hear me now?
Oh, John, yes. Okay, go ahead with your question,
sorry.
please. Thank you.
I always, trouble with the technology. All very interesting. I mean, the issues that I was thinking underlying this, though, I mean, well, several really. I mean, one would be social class factors and how those work out differently in different institutions, the diversity of the higher education system that we have in the UK, but also, and going back on history a bit and the literature on higher education. I've always actually quite liked the concept of universities being troublesome institutions. And I think the question of are they still being troublesome institutions, and to what extent and how far do they fit in with those concepts? And the last thought, which I think is also relevant to some of this, I've often said in recent years that I recognize that universities have become businesses. My question is, can they remain universities as well? And that, I think, links to quite a few of the issues that we've been hearing about this afternoon.
Okay, thank you very much, John. As we've only got 1 minute left, I think that'll be the last question, but I'll go to all four panel members if you'd like to make some comments in relation to John's question or more general reflections on this afternoon. So, Jan, do you want to start? Or
yeah, well, I mean, I think we've also sort of the issue of social class is sort of underlying all of what we've said. The idea, I think the thing about universities as businesses, I think was also another question though that we should throw back at the world, whoever, you know, can they survive as businesses? Because that's the irony of what we're seeing now in the UK, isn't it? That this whole business model doesn't work and it's falling apart. And of course, the irony is that they're trying to fix it by being even more business-like. You know, KPMG is going to save the universities. So I think the real problem universities have got into is that they're only good at one of these things, but they're trying to do the thing that they're not good at, which isn't really an answer to your question, John, but it's sort of building on it. But I think we should push back at universities and the claims that they are financial institutions, because if they are, they're not very good ones. And that's the problem they're always going to have.
Thanks, Jan. Gritt, and then we'll come to Ralph and then Rob.
Yeah, I've maybe a general comment or question. I mean, also following your presentation of your project, what is the political? Who defines what the political is? So when you ask, you're interested in the students' political knowledge, views, and behavior. Is it how they define politics? Is it how you define politics? Is it how politicians who are not happy with certain forms of political action define politics? Or what are we dealing with here? And I think actually that very notion of the political or what politics is all about is central, and, you know, to explore that as well. And I was just, you know, I just want to hear more at some point, maybe not today.
Thank you. Thank you. We shall reflect and discuss that. Ralph, any final reflections from you?
Yeah, thanks everyone for a really interesting panel and really like really good questions. I think, I mean, there was a question for me a lot earlier, which was basically asking about the sample, and I'll build from that to a more general conclusion, which is asking about the sample and the extent in the study. So just to say that we kind of sample from the general population, so we have a good range of people from different types of institution and different subject disciplines within the study that I presented. I think the more general point is that it comes back to, I think, the question that Evie asked around as kind of the number of graduates or the proportion of graduates in the population increases. I think probably what gets more important. So I guess the relative value of a degree declines as I've said, people have talk about it as a positional good, or in some of the literature it's kind of framed as a positional good. So it probably becomes more important to think about the variation within that graduate population in terms of the nature of the institution and the subject they studied. In terms of subjects, there seems to be it seems to be in general studying kind of arts, humanities, and social science subjects do make you more socially liberal than studying other types of subjects. So there is obviously still something going on in terms of the content of degrees and possibly the way it's taught. In terms of how the political socialization environment changes, or, you know, what it does in terms of your political socialization. But yeah, I think that kind of point around, and I think you'll get more of this from the work that you have planned, particularly the qualitative work, as in how different settings and different subjects and kind of people being in different social groups, I guess, at university. How all of that influences their political development, I think, will be really interesting. So I look forward to seeing it and hearing more.
Thank you very much. And Rob, the last word is with you.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a very wide-ranging discussion. I think I'll just pick up on a point John made about social class and sort of run with that slightly. because I think there are two elements to that that will be interesting for this project and other projects to perhaps consider. The first is, I think, another way of interpreting the education divide in terms of voter behaviour is in terms of a kind of populism axis. Populist parties in Britain, everywhere in fact, do much better amongst non-graduates than graduates, and populist parties' message is you're not getting anything out of the system as it is. And as higher education has become ever more important for securing higher social status, higher economic status jobs, that's become, in fact, more true. So when populist parties say to non-graduates, the system's not really working for you, they have a point, and that point has become stronger as time has gone by, because as HE has expanded, the range of jobs that require a degree has gone up. So there is some element of truth to that. And a related point, I did some work a number of years ago, which I kind of stopped, but which I think deserves being picked up. There's a status element to social class. There always has been as well. It's not just about economic security. It's also about worth as judged by others. And status is in general hierarchical and is quite it's a complex thing to measure, but it's a thing that's very real to people. And we did some work measuring it by, for example, looking at who people were willing to socialize with. And you could build a quite strong status hierarchy on that basis from people's jobs. And the jobs that required degrees were consistently rated as higher status, i.e. people who had degree level jobs did not generally socialize with people who didn't have degree level jobs. So there was a very high degree of structuring in social life. And as degrees become ever more strongly an axis of social status, that I think also feeds into politics, because the politics of populism is very often the politics of social status. It's very often the politics of they look down at you, so you should stick two fingers up to them. And I think that is going to become a growing element. And I think it'll be interesting, for example, for this project to consider that from the other side of the coin. Do people in higher education recognise that they're seen this way, or that what they're doing is acquiring social status, and that those who don't have the privilege that they have may resent that, and how do they view how to address that kind of thing? So that was just two very broad thoughts to end on, because I do think this is going to be an important and continuing sort of locus of political and electoral conflict. So I'm very much looking forward to seeing what Rachel and the team come up with.
Thanks so much, Rob, and thank you to all our speakers for your really useful reflections on our project as well, actually, which we shall certainly take on board. So apologies for running over slightly, but I'd like to thank all our four speakers for really excellent and thought-provoking presentations, and thank you all for coming along and your questions. I'm really sorry if we didn't get around to asking your question, but do email us or get in touch another way. But thank you all for coming. I think the recording should be on the CG website very soon, but hopefully we'll stay in touch and we can update you as to how our project progresses. So enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks a lot for coming. Bye bye.